So let's talk about Kosovo, Yugoslavia, and how refugee crises are used as a way to foment and stoke up racialist hatreds and tensions. Let's talk about this subject. This is a subject that is very fascinating to me because it is a great example of how a situation isn't really what it seems. You could have a refugee crisis, hundreds of thousands of refugees are entering Europe. And in the eyes of many people, it appears as though these refugees are terrorists or they are invaders. When the reality is that in this entire situation of local hating refugee, the refugee, his presence, is used as a piece of propaganda to get you to favor the nationalist parties and the nationalistic causes. And so there are a number of examples of how refugee crises are used as a way to spark up those types of racialistic, race obsessed antagonisms. And we have been seeing this in the last few years, going all the way back to 2015 when the refugee crisis commenced. We began to see the reality of Europe's dark forces raise up its ugly, ugly, moribund head. And one thing that I believe is that the refugee crisis was desired. I think it was desired. And I think that the West, I think that NATO knew very well that this refugee crisis was on the way and that it would be the result, the direct result of the Iraq War and of NATO's intervention into Libya and also Syria. How do I know that they knew that this was going to happen? For one thing, it is common sense that when you bomb a country and when you destabilize a country, people are going to leave, and they are going to leave to greener pastures. They are going to go to wealthier countries. In the paradigm of the Middle East, in the context of the Iraq and Syrian conflicts, Syrian and Iraqi refugees obviously would go into wealthier Muslim countries like Turkey, or they would go into the much desirable area of Europe. And so it's obvious that they knew that this was going to happen. We have a paralleled example to what happened in Yugoslavia in the late 1990s. It's very interesting. In September of 1998, there was a ceasefire between the KLA, or the Albanian separatist, nationalistic, tribalistic fanatics, and the Serbian forces. And the KLA wanted to take control of Kosovo. The Serbs obviously wanted to maintain control over Kosovo. The KLA were separatists, and they believed that they could take over Kosovo because Kosovo was inhabited mainly by Albanians, although there was a strong Serbian minority present in Kosovo. So there was this ceasefire that was agreed upon in September of 1998, but in December of that year, that ceasefire began to disintegrate. It began to break down, and violence began to resume. You had KLA paramilitaries going into Kosovo, murdering Serbian civilians and police officers and military personnel. There was one incident in which three Albanian gunmen masked went into a cafe and murdered six Serbian civilians. There were many cases like this. There were many cases of Albanian nationalists murdering other Albanians because those Albanians didn't believe that Serbs were their innate enemies. There were a lot of cases of Serbs being kidnapped, Albanians being kidnapped, soldiers and police officers being kidnapped. It was very, very bloody, and there were many massacres that were done by the KLA. What this eventually caused was a violent reaction from Serbian forces, Serbian paramilitaries, and also Serbian police officers and military personnel. And this would just continue on in a vicious cycle of violence, with KLA murdering Serbian civilians and officers, and Serbs responding with a lot of violence. The Americans believed, or the Americans said, actually, that Serbia needed to be bombed in order to save the Albanians. And it was actually quite questionable, because while the Americans were portraying the Serbs as these vicious monsters, the Indonesians were butchering thousands of civilians in East Timor. This was the 1990s. I mean, people think about massacres and genocide. They think of, what happened in the first half of the 20th century with World War I and World War II. In the 1990s, there were massacres taking place, be it Turks massacring Kurds, or be it Indonesians massacring East Timorese civilians. There were horrendous massacres taking place in the 1990s, and this was in our lifetime. And how did the Americans respond to the Indonesian regime? Did the Americans say, well, we need to go protect the East Timorese people? No. In fact, the Americans, the British, and the Australians continued to give arms to the Indonesians so that they could continue their slaughter in East Timor. The Americans claimed that they armed the Indonesians because they were worried that if East Timor separated from Indonesia, that it would become a strong ally with China. And so, genocide is okay because China. That's the logic of the U.S. government. So it was very questionable as to why the Americans would want to bomb the Serbs, when the fact was that there were worse massacres being done by Indonesia and Turkey, and these two countries were our allies, and they are still our close allies. And also the fact that the KLA were murdering civilians, and if you look at the record that has been shown of the breakdown of the ceasefire and what occurred during that time, you can see that the KLA began the violence, that the KLA began the aggressions with the murdering of civilians and officers. And also the fact that the United States and also Germany, the US and Germany, armed and trained the KLA, practically created the KLA. So there was a whole lot of things that were questionable with the whole narrative that the Americans and the Germans were pushing. I believe wholeheartedly that the Germans simply were continuing the very policy that they enacted in both World Wars, World War I and World War II, when the Germans wanted to control the Balkans. And so the Germans were using the Americans to help extend their own hegemony into the Balkans. And of course, there was even competition between the Germans and the Americans while this was all happening. It wasn't all just an alliance between the Germans and the Americans. In fact, the Americans were worried that if they didn't bomb the Balkans, if they didn't bomb Serbia, that the Europeans would get involved more so than the Americans with much higher intensity, and therefore the Germans would show actually more initiative than the Americans, and they would kind of have an advantage over the Americans in this rivalry over who is going to have more leverage over the Balkans in this whole, global quagmire. What's very interesting, though, is that before the bombing of Serbia, the U.S. Intelligence Committee said that there would be a horrendous refugee crisis as a result of the bombing. And they predicted that hundreds of thousands of people would be refugees as a result of the bombing. The Italian prime minister at the time, Massimo D'Alema, warned the Americans that if they bombed Serbia, there would be a horrendous refugee crisis. And there was. When Massimo D'Alema warned the Americans of a coming refugee crisis as a result of U.S. bombing, the security advisor to Bill Clinton, his name was Sandy Berger, said that if that is the case, that the U.S. would continue bombing. So in other words, when the Italians warned the Americans, if you guys bomb the Serbs, you're going to have more refugees. You're going to have hundreds of thousands of refugees. The American response to that, specifically from Sandy Berger, was that if we have a refugee crisis, well, we're just going to continue bombing. It doesn't matter. In fact, the general who was in charge of the Kosovo campaign, General Wesley Clark, said that it was very, very predictable as to what was going to take place as a result of U.S. bombing. He said that that it was already known that once the Serbs are bombed, once the Americans begin bombing, that the Serbs would go up to third gear in their violence against the Albanians, especially the KLA, and that violence would cause more Albanians to become refugees, and as a result of that as well, more Serbs and Gypsies to also become refugees. And there were hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking, I think, somewhere in the 860,000 section. That's how big this number of refugees was. And Wesley Clark even said that the mission of bombing the Serbs wasn't even to protect the Albanians. He himself said this, that had nothing to do with the mission. The mission really was to make a statement of American domination. And even before the Americans were talking about bombing the Serbs, the Germans were already talking about doing some sort of a military measure into the Balkans. And the Germans were just interested in expanding their own influence and hegemony, just like they did back in World War I and World War II. And the Americans were worried that if they didn't act, that the Germans would act and make the Americans look bad. And so the Americans were also worried about Germany getting too pompous and getting ahead of the Americans. So it was a competition between the Americans and the Germans over who was going to take control of the Balkans. It had nothing to do with helping civilians, because if they really wanted to help civilians, they would have pursued a means of negotiation as opposed to just bombing the hell out of the Serbs and bringing about more tribal tensions and more violence. The fact is that the Americans knew that it would cause a refugee crisis, and the advisor to Bill Clinton, Sandy Berger, said that if that is the case being a refugee crisis, that the Americans would just continue to bomb anyway. We would just bomb them if that's the case. We would continue to bomb them if the case is a refugee crisis. So the Americans not only knew that there was going to be a refugee crisis, the Americans wanted a refugee crisis. So I take that story, this story of Kosovo, the story of the eventual destruction of Yugoslavia, and I make it into a parallel with the destruction of the established government apparatus in the Middle East, which the Americans destroyed. And by the established government apparatus, I mean the old school Arab dictators. We're talking Saddam Hussein, we're talking Mubarak, we're talking Bashar al-Assad, we're talking Gaddafi. These people formed the establishment governmental system of the Middle East, which was used by NATO, by the Americans for a very long time to control the Middle East, because the Americans knew that leaders like Saddam are important to maintain order in that region. And so by removing these leaders, the Americans knew that it would bring disorder and it would bring more tribal violence, just as they knew that by bombing the Serbs, they would bring about more tribal violence in Kosovo. And they would bring about a refugee crisis, just like the Americans knew that there was going to be a refugee crisis as a result of NATO intervention into the Middle East. And I think that the Americans wanted a refugee crisis because it would stoke nationalism in Europe. Now, this aspect of my belief, I can't emphatically prove. But what I can do is reference the fact that for decades, the Americans were backing Nazi and nationalist paramilitaries during the Cold War, and they were also bringing in thousands of Nazi scientists into the US and giving them six-digit figure salaries, also during the Cold War. This was under Operation Paperclip. And I know for a fact that the Americans wanted nationalism to spark in Europe as a way to fight the left and the socialists, the left-wing socialists. They were supporting the right-wing socialists. Right-wing socialism is okay. Left-wing socialism is bad. And yeah, left-wing socialism, workers of the world unite, and right-wing socialism is, white workers unite. Let's kill the brown folks or whatever. So we know for a fact that the Americans at NATO wanted nationalism to spark in Europe. The refugee crisis, which was a direct result, and it continues to be a result of U.S. intervention in the Middle East, has been the greatest catalyst towards the sparking of nationalism in Europe. So for decades, the Americans wanted nationalism to spark in Europe during the Gladio operations. They didn't really succeed all too well, but with the refugee crisis, the dream of Gladio has truly manifested. And it's really a monster that the Americans have unleashed. And we can't put it back into the box. We can't. And it's very scary to see what's happening, really. But anyway, I've talked long enough. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.